Hey everyone, so in this video here we're going to explore the toe touch or forward flexion with a little bit more of a specific focus on the sagittal plane behavior of the rib cage, thoracic spine, lumbar spine and pelvis. Okay, we've received quite a few questions asking us to explore this in a little bit more detail because it can be quite confusing if we're looking at something from a joint biased perspective versus more of a segmental biased perspective, okay? Now, when we talk about using more of a segmental biased or segmental based analysis, it doesn't mean that this is better than a joint based analysis. It just gives us the ability to characterize the directional behavior of those segments. And for us at IKN, we feel as though this gives us more information as to how we can guide our rehab then and our loading strategies in an effort to promote variability. So if one segment can't move in a certain direction, then we can organize our rehab, our loading, our physical stress application via exercise, movement, manual therapy, whatever it might be, with the intention to promote motion of that segment in that direction of limitation, and then organize how we can manipulate the neighboring segments as well. Okay, so we have our little stick man here. We have the head, the rib cage, thoracic spine or the thorax, the lumbar spine and the pelvis. Okay, now everybody will adopt a different resting posture. So you'll have clients that rest in more of a flex position of the thoracic spine, but we can't necessarily only use their resting posture to help us understand what movements they are capable of. All it gives us is an insight into their resting posture. So just because someone is very flexed at the thoracic spine does not mean they don't have access to thoracic extension. Just because someone's very extended at the spine doesn't mean they also don't have the ability to flex their spine as they move through flexion. So we can't fall into the trap of only using someone's resting posture to characterize what their body is capable of doing from a movement standpoint. Okay, so as we move through the toe touch, if we look at it from what's happening above the lumbar spine, the pelvis first, very often we're going to initiate that movement through the upper limbs, the thoracic spine, rib cage, and the head. So we're actually going to typically see, sorry if I'm blocking the screen now, my artistic skills aren't great when I'm drawing from the side, but what we're typically going to see is we're going to see the pelvis maintain pretty much the same position, but we're going to see the thoracic spine and the head rotate forward, okay? So when we talk about rotation of segments, and very often we think about joint rotation as something that's occurring in the transverse plane. But when you look at things from a segmental standpoint, this is based on the biomechanical studies or the field of biomechanics, which looks at the difference between angular motion and then linear motion. So when segments move on a curved path, so when that rib cage, thoracic spine rotates forward, think of that as occurring on a curved path. That rotates forward. So think of it as occurring on a bicycle wheel, okay, where it's rotating forward. Yes, it's occurring in the sagittal plane, but it's still moving on an angular or curved path. That's why we can consider it as a forward rotation of the thoracic spine, rib cage, the head, for example, cervical spine. Everything's rotating forward, okay? But we haven't really seen in this situation here the pelvis begin to rotate forward. So we can say that that pelvis is rotated backwards relative to the forward rotating thoracic spine and rib cage and head and cervical spine, okay? That ability of the pelvis to stay posteriorly rotated relative to the spine rotating over the top gives the spine the ability to flex. If that pelvis was to rotate forward with that spine early on, then it would be more like a hinge, okay? So we're not actually giving the spine the opportunity then to flex or to rotate forward. So fundamentally, spinal flexion is a rotation forward of the spinal column, okay? Then as we progress further forward, we can see how that pelvis then will begin to tip forward along with the lumbar spine, the rib cage, the head, the limbs will typically maintain the same position. So then we'll see that pelvis begin to rotate forward with the ribcage thoracic spine, okay? But the key thing here is that the pelvis is still relatively posteriorly rotated relative to the thoracic spine and ribcage, okay? But it's still rotating forward relative to the femoral segment, okay? So we have to appreciate what's happening between the ribcage, thoracic spine, lumbar spine, pelvis, and femur, okay? Because we still have that pelvis rotated back, so we still have length occurring at the lumbar extensors. We still have more shortening occurring at the lumbar flexors, okay? And then, of course, towards the end range of the toe touch, we're, of course, going to be moving that pelvis even more so through flexion. Have the hands obviously touching the toes, but we're still expressing that opposing rotation between the thoracic spine ribcage and the pelvis, because relative to the thoracic spine, the pelvis is rotated backwards and the ribcage thoracic spine is continuing to rotate forward, as well as the lumbar spine. Okay, so lumbar spine, thoracic spine, ribcage, head is all rotating forward. Relative to that, the pelvis is rotating backwards. That gives the spine the opportunity to flex and rotate forward. Okay, but relative to the femur, the pelvis is rotating forward. Okay, that's hip flexion, but it's more pelvic dominant hip flexion. Okay, now why is this important to understand when we look at things from a standing, more erect position, and as we progress through the early, the middle, and the later phases of the toe touch? This is important to understand because it gives us the opportunity to characterize how the individual is completing that task. And it gives us the opportunity to be a bit more specific in how we are identifying what segment is not contributing to the ability to complete that toe touch, to achieve that outcome, which is to touch your toes, okay? So you may have clients that struggle to touch their toes, but they are very, very flexed at their spine from the very beginning of the toe touch. And as they progress through the middle phases and they can progress into the later phases of the toe touch, but they're demonstrating a great deal of lumbar flexion, then what may be contributing to that limitation in the toe touch may be the pelvis's ability to rotate forward over top the femur, in which case we can actually utilize strategies to try and concentrate that motion at the pelvis relative to the femur. It may not be a situation in that client scenario where they have to be able to flex their spine more, but we actually need to allow the pelvis to contribute to that flexion or that rotation forward of the trunk relative to the femur, okay? We may also see a situation where the individual is very extended at the spine, okay? And if the individual is very extended at the spine, it may, again, we have to look more deeply into other assessments, but it may limit the ability of the pelvis to rotate posteriorly relative to the lumbar spine, relative to the thoracic spine, because when we are more extended at the spine, that will typically couple with a forward rotation of the pelvis. That will typically couple with a more of an extension at the lumbar spine and more of an extension at the thoracic spine, okay? So if they're unable to touch their toes and they demonstrate a limitation in their spinal flexion ability, then we may have to organize our strategies around promoting that spinal flexion and promoting the ability of the pelvis to posteriorly rotate may be a significant component of what rehab or loading may look like for that individual to afford the spine the ability to flex, okay? So again, yes, it may seem a bit more complex when we're trying to analyze movement, but it does give us clear information about what segments are contributing, what segments are not contributing, and it makes a little bit more sense when we look at things from a directional standpoint as opposed to looking at something like lumbar flexion or hip flexion. It doesn't really offer us the ability to understand what direction limitations are present at the segments, which can sometimes make your understanding of what you might do from a loading standpoint. If you're trying to encourage more range of motion, if you're trying to encourage an increase in tolerance to load and an increase in force generation, for example, at a specific muscular tissue. Because what's important to consider here is that muscles Muscles do not pull on joints, they pull on segments. Muscles connect segments to segment, okay? One segment to a neighboring segment, or one segment to a distant segment. They don't pull on joints. It's the motion of the segments that creates motion at the joint. So the joint is more of a relative representation of how two segments are interacting with each other, okay? So it can get messy when we try to only analyze movement through a joint-based lens. It's not a bad way to do it. In our opinion, it just doesn't give us all the necessary information to guide what we're going to do from a rehab and loading standpoint, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Of course, we can go deeper into this analysis if you'd like, but the key thing that I want you to take away from this is considering how the ability of that pelvis to posteriorly rotate affords the ability of the lumbar spine, thoracic spine, rib cage, cervical spine, head to rotate forward or flex forward to enable you to complete that toe touch from an initial to middle phase, and then towards the end phase of the toe touch. That's when we want that pelvis to begin to rotate much more so over top the femur, okay? And of course, on top of that as well, understanding we briefly mentioned this, but understanding both the angular kinematics, or the angular motions of segments, relative to the linear motions of segments, because during the toe touch as well, there is going to be more of a posterior translation of the pelvis to further afford that the ability of the pelvis to rotate over the femur as well. Because if the pelvis was to translate forward, you're just going to fall flat on your face. Okay. So that will be a representation of a translation or a linear motion where it's actually moving on a linear path. Whereas what we're speaking about here is the motion of segments rotating on a curved path. So the forward rotation of the thoracic spine, the backward rotation of the pelvis. And of course, we can use this type of analysis when we're looking at other segments as well. Okay, so again, hopefully that made sense. If you have any more questions, please let us know below.